Plato sat and pondered why Socrates with questions high. Aristotle's mind on fire, wisdom turning like a pyre.
Ancient Greece, apart from the myths and architecture, we almost immediately think of the most impactful philosophers of the era. These were Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, a most famous lineage of thinkers, each acting as the teacher of the next. Socrates was a bit of a character. He exhibited eccentric behavior and was generally thought of as enigmatic and irreverent. He produced no written text of his own. Every direct record we have of him is through the works of others, like Plato, his pupil, Aristophanes, a comedic playwright, and Xenophon, a historian. The Socratic problem in academia refers to the fact that there are several different interpretations of who he was and exactly what his ideas were, not unlike many of his predecessors, and even some more recent thinkers, but undoubtedly none as significant as him. Undisputedly, Socrates was a public figure in that he not only attended the busiest venues of his hometown, Athens, but he also frequently gave unprompted speeches and interloped experts or prominent figures on the streets for public demonstrations. His method of argumentation was called maieutic, from Greek maieutikos, meaning midwifery, in that through fierce questioning of established commonsensical ideas, he would birth new and better ones. This has been disputed, however, as in most instances, much like Zeno of Elea, this method was seemingly only focused on reducing the opponent's perspectives into absurd consequences, known today as the appeal to extremes, and not necessarily committed to creating new ideas. Socrates was frequently contrasted by Plato with the sophists, who would claim great knowledge and charge for it. Rather, Socrates' goal was to demonstrate the ignorance or the lack of knowledge one would have about matters they'd take for granted, while also acknowledging his own, since this would be the prerequisite for acquiring wisdom. Thus his famous phrase, "I know that I know nothing." He would confront a judge, for example, and inquire over the concept of justice, attempting to refute his response by leading the judge's response to extreme cases and into contradiction. From there, he would postulate further definitions and repeat the method until a better understanding of justice would arise. The examination of life, practices, and virtues would be crucial for him, as knowledge and wisdom would be the only way to achieve true happiness and virtue, or to live in a good manner. Evil and misery, thus, would be connected with ignorance or lack of knowledge. To know, then, what is good is to be motivated to act in a good manner. This is one of the first proper ethical systems ever developed, with clear definitions of what is good and bad, and a reasonably adequate theory of action concerning them. Whether he had any actual faith is a point of contention, as he believed in an immortal soul akin to the divine, and considered that to know and constantly examine the soul through philosophy would be the best way of worshipping the gods, if they exist. It is this way that he purportedly lived and died, as his notoriety and constant confrontation of influential figures resulted in a trial which led to his demise. He was accused of corrupting the youth, as he frequented popular places with young people and was known for having an entourage around him. He was accused of impiety against the Athenian gods and religious institutions, and was also considered a threat to democracy, as his practices led him to question nature without relying on gods, and also to question political concepts, thus by proxy important religious figures and politicians. Because of this, he was sentenced to death, a sentence he embraced. Exile was an option, and his followers offered to break him out, but he refused. He drank hemlock and died in 399 BCE. Let's now move on to the most famous pupil of Socrates. Plato veered in similar fashion in constructing his ethical, political, and metaphysical conceptions into a unified theory. He believed, as did his tutor Socrates, that true philosophy was only accessed in debates and conversations, but he manifested this by writing in the form of descriptive dialogues. Whether these truly happened or were an accurate portrayal of real people is up for discussion, but the fact is that they are the first major written source of philosophy from that time and before. As with the works of Aristotle, they are our primary reference to the ideas of these early thinkers, and also played a significant role in shaping what philosophy became. Plato's embrace of his teacher's method was so deep that he even questioned our perception of reality itself. As many other Greeks of his time and before him, he was fascinated with mathematical and geometrical perfection, which led him to notice how the world obtained by the senses, or the material world, was always flawed, and our perception never truly reliable. However, the laws of geometry were always constant, unchanging. This led Plato to believe in a world of pure reason, an abstract reality which underlies all we ever perceive with our faulty senses. From this he made his famous analogy comparing reality to life in a cave. We are held as prisoners since childhood, facing moving shadows on a wall, cast from a great fire, hearing echoes, all from puppeteers hiding in a wall behind us. We'd see the shadow of a chair and call it a chair. Hear the sound of a bird and associate it with a bird, but these would be mere illusions. One could even be freed and made to look at their source, but the sheer brightness of the fire would hurt, and the prisoner would gladly return to their ignorance in the shadows. But if one would strive beyond the light, even against their will, past the brightness of the fire and into the sun, their eyes would eventually adjust to the sight of the actual objects in the real world. However, in attempting to return to free their former fellow prisoners, their eyes would struggle to adjust to the cave's darkness, and his confused blindness to them would be a sign to not follow his path. This world outside the cave would be the world of the forms, the perfect abstract world, holding all knowledge in its purest incarnation, and the shadows would represent the limited world of the senses. The puppeteers would be scientists and mathematicians attempting to understand the forms, and the outside world would be the focus of philosophy. The realm of forms then would contain not only the pure essences of geometry, for example, but also of the virtues and the good itself, which would be a transcendental or an immaterial property of everything good. Much like Socrates, good actions would require proper knowledge of good and exercise of virtues for a happy, fruitful life. To break the shackles, then, one would need proper education, especially from philosophers, which would not be easy or intuitive, as it would be akin to the Socratic method, with a greater focus on discussion, as evident in his manner of writing, and the abstraction into the ideal world of the forms. He would call this the dialectic method. This entire process intertwines with his political ideas, where in his Republic, led of course by a philosopher king, those which excelled in certain virtues would act in public roles accordingly, and the dialectic method of education would be the standard in order to stimulate everyone into a philosophical life. The most courageous would be soldiers. Those with a proper equilibrium of virtues would be a judge, as justice would be a virtue encompassing all others, and so on. Plato already had written on utopias, and this version of government, to him, would be reasonably realistic, even if difficult to achieve. Although an in-depth analysis of both Socrates and Plato would take a lifetime, hopefully we now have a better grasp of these important foundational figures for human knowledge. Continuing with our earlier analysis of the classical Greek period, Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BCE, continued the direct line of tutelage from Socrates and Plato. By most accounts, he was the first scientist as we understand the term today. Biology, astronomy, geology, and many other fields, if he did not invent it, he established the major foundations for it to thrive. Much like his predecessors, Aristotle did not have a clear separation between philosophy, science, politics, or any branch of knowledge. Everything was interwoven. His method of research, however, was much more focused on the senses and observation. He was empirical, from the Greek empirikos, meaning practice and experience, in contrast with other abstract thought. He would observe animals and plants in order to analyze them, and attempt to understand their behavior and characteristics through his observation. Afterwards, all explanations must be adequate and follow a rigorous format in order to maintain objectivity. He was very interested in language, with extensive writings in rhetoric, the art of guiding public emotions through words intended to convince others. Dialectics, its counterpart, is a more private and academic manner of debating based on developing an argument with premises that are based on the concessions of another. And finally, logic, which is a tool for analyzing discourse in a thorough and quasi-mathematical manner, where a conclusion must, by necessity, be a direct result of its premises. As we already saw, this was an essential tool for discourse clarification in every science, and this was the first time it was established explicitly. Logic allowed us to see beyond any flair or trick of language to understand the core of what is being said. We'll delve further in this creation of his in the next tutorial, but it was undeniably a game changer for any future scientific endeavor, a system so reliable that it went without major overhaul until the early 20th century. However, being such an early scientist also meant treading through uncharted territory, so Aristotle held many false beliefs. He believed life could spring from nothing, due to observing eels lacking gonads simply appearing in mud, unaware that they'd only developed them in a journey very far from there. Still in the realm of gonads, he theorized that snakes do not have two legs because they do not have penises. Twice wrong on a single affirmation, as they do have penises, and the attributes are clearly unrelated. He also believed women had fewer teeth, colder blood, and that enslavement could be natural to some people lacking rational skills, among other bad ideas. But we can see a pattern here. Aristotle was very concerned with the purpose of things. He posited the existence of a single primary substance from which everything arose, taking different forms with a capital F. But unlike Plato, we can properly understand them with experience, a direct criticism of Plato, as according to Aristotle, Plato's theory of forms could not account for creation and modification. His physics postulate that forms cannot change without interference, even if non-intentional. Thus, everything has a purpose, or a telos in Greek, as the heart beats for pumping blood, the lungs function for breathing air, and so on. Not only that, but species also have these purposes, or their own function. Cats excel in being agile. Horses are extremely vigorous, and so they live happily or flourish when they exercise these characteristics. This biological perspective connected to a purpose, which we can call a teleological perspective, would dominate biology until Darwin, who would be the first to develop a system for understanding how physical characteristics rise from adaptation and selection rather than proper function. Humans, on the other hand, are social animals with a natural desire for knowledge, according to Aristotle. They thrive on several levels of communities, from their close family to the entire city they live in, and they do so by communicating. Thus, the function of humans is rational discourse, or reason. To act in a good manner, then, is to rationally analyze how a certain action can be good or not. Following his criticism of the Platonic forms, what is good is too ever-changing, and related to every individual context it appears in. For Aristotle, prudence is the virtue that should lead one's moral life. To deliberate prudently is to better judge which action is appropriate in a given situation. For example, if you saw someone attempting to kill another person, what would you do? For Aristotle, vice, the opposite of virtue, would be characterized by the extremes, either a lack of or excess of virtue. In this example, running away with no intention to look back is a lack of courage, which we can call cowardice, while trying to overpower or kill the attacker would be an excess of courage, or rashness. To act virtuously would be to inform your courage with prudence. You could attempt to notify the authorities, or perhaps disarm or immobilize the attacker. This could be viewed as acting with the right balance of courage and prudence. Yet the correct path would never be a single one, and also never the same, because the virtuous act depends heavily on the context. There is ambiguity halfway between actions, as running away to survive or to attempt to notify authorities are both closer to simply abandoning the victim than attempting to overpower a dangerous person. There's no easy path to virtuous life, but habit is the key. The exercise of rational prudence, then, without neglecting your emotions, would lead to virtuous actions that help the agent reach its telos, or its goal as a person, which is to flourish as a human being and achieve true happiness. This brand of virtue ethics, focusing on improving human action rather than identifying objective, immutable principles of what is good or bad, is still very strong in current philosophical perspectives, surviving many iterations and different interpretations to be one of the three major ethical schools still being studied. Adapting Plato both in method and in form, Aristotle then constructed his political theory based on these previous conceptions of humans and their actions. The best governments and political systems would be the ones which provide the best environment for happiness and flourishing. Justice, thus, would be an important virtue while analyzing methods of government, and so he proposed three different methods, each with a virtuous and vicious version. When a single ruler acts toward the flourishing of most of the population, we have a virtuous kingship. If this ruler acts for a minority as for himself, it is a tyranny. If a government of a few chosen best people, an aristocracy, would act toward the flourishing of the many, it'd be even better than the kingship, as it is harder to corrupt a few people than just one person holding all the power. However, a party, typically of the rich few governing only for themselves, an oligarchy, would be its vicious version. Democracy comes next, but as the deviant version of the polity or constitutional government, since the former would imply a government of the majority only for the majority, usually the poor, according to Aristotle, while the latter would be a government of the majority for everyone. However, democracy is still the best among the worst, and he criticizes the utopian perspective of his predecessors, as democracy might realistically be the best existing choice until everyone is able to become virtuous. It would seem to be the case that pooling the different virtues of many citizens is better than relying on the virtues of only a few aristocrats. Aristotle's work was wide and far-reaching. Much of his work remained obscure during the early Middle Ages, but thanks to the preservation of his original works and translations made by Muslim scholars, in the 12th and 13th centuries, Aristotle's works were rediscovered with new Latin translations and commentaries, thus heavily influencing philosophy in medieval times, as we shall see later. However, like many other figures from the ancient world, only slightly more than 30 of his treatises survived from almost 200. Plato was one of the lucky few whose entire works survived these almost 2,400 years.